Cops harass a 93-year-old man at Riverside docks, throwing around their authority like it's a weapon, mocking his tattered clothes and weathered hands that have cast fishing lines into these waters for over 7 decades. They see James Harrison as nothing more than an easy target, another powerless old-timer they can intimidate for their own amusement. It's a game they've played before, bullying those they think can't fight back. But these arrogant officers are about to learn the most expensive lesson of their careers. The quiet fisherman they're taunting isn't just another elderly victim. He's the father of Judge Michael Harrison, known throughout the state as the Gavel of God, a man whose very name makes corrupt officials tremble. This isn't just another story of power gone wrong. This is about how a group of badge-wearing bullies are about to discover that true justice wears a black robe, not a blue uniform. In the coming days, they'll learn that every act of cruelty, every abuse of power they've ever committed, is about to be examined under the unforgiving light of a courtroom, presided over by a son who spent his career making sure no one stands above the law, especially those sworn to uphold it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog rolled gently across Riverside's municipal dock, parting briefly as James Harrison's weathered boots made their familiar journey down the creaking wooden planks. At 93, his steps were slower than they used to be, but they carried the same purpose they had for the past 7 decades. Every morning, rain or shine, James arrived at exactly 5:30 a.m., his old tackle box swinging gently at his side, the metal clasps worn smooth from years of use. Local vendors setting up their morning fish market smiled warmly as he passed. To them, James wasn't just another fisherman. He was as much a part of the dock as the salt-worn pilings that held it above the water. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," called Maria from her fruit stand, the same way she had for the past 20 years. She remembered how he'd helped her set up shop when she was just starting, offering advice about the best times to catch the morning crowd. James made his way to his usual spot, the third piling from the end where the water ran a little deeper, and the fish tended to gather in the early morning shadows. His hands, marked by liver spots and lined with years of sun exposure, moved with practiced precision as he set up his gear. Each motion was deliberate, a ritual perfected through thousands of repetitions. The old man's mind drifted, as it often did during these quiet moments, to the days when a much smaller set of hands would mirror his movements. He could still see young Michael, barely tall enough to peek over the dock's edge, watching intently as his father demonstrated how to tie the perfect fisherman's knot. "Patience, son," he'd say, both about the fishing and about life. "The best things come to those who know how to wait." Those lessons seemed to have stuck. Michael had taken that patience into the courtroom, becoming known for his methodical approach to justice. James smiled, remembering how his son had once compared cross-examination to fishing. You have to know when to let out the line and when to reel them in. The dock was James's sanctuary, a place where social status meant nothing against the simple metrics of skill and patience. Here, he wasn't Judge Harrison's father. He was just James, the old fisherman who could read the water better than most could read a book. The regulars who fished alongside him didn't care about his son's position or his modest means. They respected him for his quiet dignity, his willingness to share his knowledge, and his uncanny ability to know exactly where the fish would be biting. A young boy approached, clutching a tangled mess of fishing line. Without a word, James gestured for him to sit on the neighboring crate. His gnarled fingers worked methodically, untangling the line while quietly explaining how to avoid such knots in the future. This was how he'd spent countless mornings, sharing not just fishing knowledge, but life lessons wrapped in simple conversations about bait and tides. The rising sun painted the water in shades of amber and gold, catching on the silver of James's hair. He'd seen thousands of such sunrises from this spot, each one a reminder of life's continuing beauty. His old canvas jacket, patched in several places but still serviceable, kept the morning chill at bay. He'd never seen the point in buying expensive fishing gear or fancy clothes, a lesson in humility he'd passed on to Michael, along with everything else. The dock began to fill with its regular morning crowd. Tourists with their shiny new rods mixed with weathered commercial fishermen preparing for a day at sea. James acknowledged them all with the same gentle nod, a gesture that carried the weight of decades of shared mornings. To the younger fisherman, he was a living legend, a testament to the timeless art of patience and perseverance. To the old-timers, he was a trusted friend who had seen them through marriages, children, grandchildren, and all of life's storms. As the morning wore on, James's bucket slowly filled with fish. Nothing spectacular, but enough to share with Maria and some of the other vendors who always made sure he never went without fresh fruit or bread. It was a simple exchange that spoke to the kind of community that still existed here on the docks, away from the politics and pretense of the town proper. Here a man was measured by his character, not his wallet or his connections. The courthouse loomed over downtown like a marble sentinel, its classical columns casting long shadows across the morning crowds. Inside courtroom 412, Judge Michael Harrison's reputation preceded him like an invisible force. Lawyers straightened, their ties instinctively, and even the most hardened criminals seemed to shrink under his steady gaze. They called him the Gavel of God, not for any religious fervor, but for his unwavering commitment to justice and his almost supernatural ability to see through deception. At 65, Michael Harrison carried himself with the same quiet dignity he'd learned from his father. His silver hair was always impeccably trimmed, his black robe pressed to perfection, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, sharp and observant, missing nothing. Those eyes had seen through countless lies, stripped away layers of legal maneuvering, and reduced many a corrupt official to stammering confessions. Today's case was typical of his docket, a city councilman accused of taking bribes. The defense attorney was mid-motion, his expensive suit and practiced charm failing to mask the weakness of his arguments. Judge Harrison listened with the patience of a fisherman, something his father had taught him long ago. Let them play out their line, show their hand, reveal their weaknesses. Your Honor, the attorney concluded, my client's actions were merely standard business practices, nothing more. The words hung in the air like bait on a hook. Michael thought of his father's voice. Son, a fish that bites too quickly doesn't see the hook. He'd applied that wisdom throughout his career, waiting for the right moment to strike. Counselor, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. Would you care to explain how accepting unmarked envelopes in parking garages constitutes standard business practice? The attorney faltered, his carefully constructed argument unraveling. In the gallery, several journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads. Judge Harrison's questioning was legendary, precise, methodical, and devastating to those who came to his courtroom with unclean hands. His reputation had been built case by case, starting 20 years ago when he'd sentenced the mayor's brother for corruption. The political pressure had been intense, but Michael remembered standing at the dock with his father that weekend, casting lines into the quiet water. The right path isn't always the easy one, James had said, not directly addressing the case, but understanding his son's burden. But it's the only one that lets you sleep at night. The local bar association had a saying, if you're honest, Harrison's courtroom is a temple. If you're corrupt, it's a tomb. He'd earned that reputation by being incorruptible in a system where money and influence often spoke louder than law. His methods were simple: thorough preparation, careful attention to detail, and an unflinching willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led. Even now, with retirement age approaching, Michael maintained the same rigorous schedule. He arrived at the courthouse before dawn, reviewing cases in the quiet hours, just as his father still arrived at the dock in the pre-dawn darkness. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Two men, father and son, each casting their lines in their own way, each pursuing truth and sustenance in their chosen waters. His clerk appeared at his chamber door, carrying yet another stack of files. "Judge, Harrison, the FBI just sent over additional evidence in the Richardson case." Michael nodded, already mentally preparing for another late night. The Richardson case, a complex web of police corruption that had been brewing for months. He'd seen too many similar cases, watched too many good cops stay silent while bad ones abused their power. The sight of his father's old fishing cap, kept on a shelf in his chambers, caught his eye. It was a reminder of simpler times, of early morning lessons about patience, integrity, and the importance of standing firm when the current pulled hard. Those lessons had served him well in this room, where the currents of power and money constantly tried to erode the foundations of justice. Small photo sat beside the cap, him and his father at the dock, taken just last Sunday. Despite his position and power, Michael still made time every week to fish with his father. Those quiet mornings were his sanctuary, a reminder of what really mattered. In his father's presence, he wasn't Judge Harrison, the feared arbiter of justice. He was just Michael, a son, learning there were still lessons to be gained from those weathered hands and that quiet wisdom. Officers Mark Davidson and Thomas Reed sat in their patrol car near the docks, steam rising from their coffee cups in the early morning air. Their cruiser, parked in the shadow of an old warehouse, had become their unofficial throne from which they ruled their small domain. With 15 years on the force, Davidson had mastered the art of working the system, while Reed, his partner of 5 years, had proven an eager student in the games of power and intimidation. "Check out the haul from yesterday," Davidson smirked, pulling out his wallet. $200 bills peeked out, protection money from the food trucks that lined the waterfront during lunch hour. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the power. The rush that came from watching people bend to their will. Their reputation in the department was a carefully crafted image. To their superiors, they were model officers, always on time with paperwork, maintaining high arrest numbers, never causing obvious trouble. But on the streets, particularly around the docks and older parts of town, their badge meant something. Else entirely, it was a license to intimidate, to establish their own brand of order. Last week they'd roughed up a street vendor for being too slow with his monthly payments. The week before, they'd detained a college student for suspicious behavior, code for refusing to show enough respect. Complaints had been filed, of course, but they always disappeared into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of internal affairs. Davidson had friends in the right places, and Reed's uncle was on the city council. "Remember that old lady who tried to report us?" Reed chuckled, scrolling through his phone. Suddenly her grandson had 3 unpaid parking tickets and a broken taillight. Their methods were effective because they understood the system. How to push just hard enough without leaving evidence. How to make threats that couldn't be proven. How to ensure silence through fear. The morning shift supervisor, Lieutenant Hayes, was one of their most valuable assets. He'd been on the force for 25 years and understood the old way of doing things. A percentage of their unofficial income found its way to his desk, disguised as birthday cards or holiday gifts. In return, complaint forms mysteriously vanished, and patrol schedules always worked in their favor. A young rookie had tried to challenge them once, going directly to internal affairs with evidence of their protection racket. Within a month, he'd been involved in 3 incidents requiring investigation, found himself assigned to the worst shifts, and eventually transferred to traffic duty on the outskirts of town. The message was clear. The system protected its own, especially those who knew how to work it. Their cruiser was spotless, their uniforms immaculate. Image was everything in their game. They'd learned that a clean-cut appearance and professional demeanor made it harder for victims to be believed. Who would trust the word of a street vendor over 2 decorated officers with exemplary service records? Davidson watched an elderly woman hurry past their car, clutching her purse tighter. The fear in her eyes gave him that familiar rush of power. "See that, rookie?" he'd told Reed during his first week. "Respect and fear are the same thing in this job." Reed had learned well, maybe too well. Sometimes his enthusiasm for their additional duties made even Davidson uncomfortable, though he'd never admit it. Their shift supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, a noise complaint near the pier. Davidson started the engine, a predatory smile crossing his face. These early morning calls were their favorite. Few witnesses, plenty of opportunities for discretionary enforcement. They'd developed a system. Davidson would play the reasonable officer, while Reed acted as the aggressive enforcer. Good cop, bad cop, but both were equally corrupt. Years of unchecked authority had made them bold. They'd started small, looking the other way for certain businesses, accepting free meals and small favors. But power, like a drug, demanded ever-increasing doses. Now they ran a sophisticated operation of intimidation and extortion, protected by a network of corrupt officials and the thin blue line of silence that pervaded the department. "Let's make our rounds," Davidson said, pulling away from their watching post. "Remind some people about their civic duties." Reed nodded, already anticipating the fear they'd inspire, the power they'd exercise. Neither of them noticed the small camera mounted on the warehouse wall, its lens capturing their daily rituals for an investigation they didn't know existed. The morning had started like any other at Riverside docks. James Harrison sat on his weathered wooden crate, his line cast into the gentle current, when officers Davidson and Reed's patrol car rolled to a stop near his usual spot. The crunch of their boots on the wooden planks carried an intentional heaviness, a sound meant to demand attention and inspire fear. "Well, what do we have here?" Davidson's voice cut through the peaceful morning air. "Looks like we've got ourselves a vagrant." He nudged Reed, who smirked on cue. James continued fishing, his weathered hands steady on his rod, dignity evident in his silence. "Sir, this is a restricted area," Reed announced, despite the dozen other fishermen scattered along the dock. His hand rested casually on his belt, close to his baton, a subtle threat he'd perfected over years of intimidation. Maria, watching from her fruit stand, clutched her apron nervously. She'd seen these officers in action before, knew their reputation. Other regulars at the dock began to notice the confrontation, their morning routines falling silent as tension filled the air. "I've been fishing here for 70 years, James replied quietly, his voice carrying the calm of countless dawns, "since before either of you were born." He didn't look up, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing fear in his eyes. Davidson stepped closer, deliberately scuffing his boot against James's tackle box. "Times change, old man. Maybe you haven't heard, but there are new regulations about loitering." The lie rolled smoothly off his tongue, practiced and poisonous. A young dock worker, Tommy Chen, had his phone out, recording discreetly from behind a stack of crates. He'd witnessed these officers' behavior before, but had never dared to document it. Something about seeing them target Mr. Harrison, the dock's beloved elder, sparked a courage he didn't know he had. "Your clothes are a mess, old-timer," Reed chimed in, circling around to James's other side, looking pretty suspicious. "Maybe we need to run a check, see if you got any outstanding warrants." The threat hung in the morning air like a storm. "Cloud," though, James finally looked up, his eyes meeting Davidson's with a steadiness that momentarily unsettled the officer. "My name is James Harrison. I have all proper licenses and permissions to fish here." His voice remained level. Decades of dignity, evident in every word. "Harrison," Davidson sneered, recovering his composure. "What, you think dropping some random name's gonna impress us?" He kicked the tackle box, sending it sliding across the dock. Fishing lures and hooks scattered across the wooden planks. The small crowd of onlookers grew, their collective breath held. Some had their phones out now, following Tommy's lead. Maria had tears in her eyes, her hands trembling as she watched these uniformed bullies torment a man who'd shown nothing but kindness to everyone at the dock. "Stand up," Reed demanded, his hand now gripping his baton. Let's see some ID. The morning sun glinted off his badge, a symbol of authority twisted into a tool of intimidation. James carefully reeled in his line, placed his rod down, and reached for his wallet with deliberate slowness. His hands, marked by decades of honest work, didn't shake. He'd faced worse in his 93 years, seen real courage and real cowardice, learned the difference between power and authority. What's this? Davidson snatched the wallet, rifling through it with exaggerated roughness. Social security cards pretty worn out. Could be fake. He exchanged knowing looks with Reed, their practiced routine in full swing. "Sir," a brave voice called out. It was Tommy, stepping forward despite his fear. "Everyone here knows Mr. Harrison. He's been here longer than anyone." Others nodded in agreement, their presence forming a silent witness to the injustice unfolding. "Stay out of this," Reed snapped, turning his intimidating gaze on Tommy. "Unless you want us taking a closer look at your documentation status." Tommy stepped back, but his phone kept recording, capturing every moment of the officer's abuse of power. James stood slowly, his full height undiminished by age. "Young men," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "my son taught me something important about the law. It's meant to protect, not intimidate, to serve, not to bully." Davidson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the water. "Your son? What's he gonna do? Write a strongly worded letter?" He tossed James's wallet onto the ground, fishing license and photos spilling out. As James bent to collect his scattered belongings, Reed deliberately placed his boot on one of the photos. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Hope that wasn't important." The photo, showing James and his son at a judicial ceremony, now bore a muddy boot print across its surface. The confrontation had drawn more witnesses than the officers realized. Phones recorded from multiple angles, capturing their cruelty in high definition. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dock, a silent witness to an abuse of power that would soon send shockwaves through the entire department. By noon, Tommy Chen's video had spread through the Riverside community like wildfire. The footage, shaky but clear, showed every moment of the officer's cruelty, from the deliberate scuffing of the tackle box to the boot print on the family. Ivoto, local Facebook groups buzzed with outrage, and the town's community message boards filled with similar stories about officers Davidson and Reed. Maria closed her fruit stand early, her hands still trembling as she dialed numbers on her phone. "Carmen, you won't believe what those officers did to Mr. Harrison today." Her voice carried through the grapevine of dock vendors, each call adding another witness account to the growing narrative. "They treated him like garbage, Carmen. The man who helped all of us build our businesses here." In the courthouse cafeteria, a clerk scrolled through her phone during lunch break, the video playing quietly on her screen. Her gasp caught the attention of neighboring tables. "Isn't that Judge Harrison's father?" The whispers began, spreading through the building's marble halls like autumn leaves in the wind. Local reporter Sarah Chen, Tommy's sister, sat at her desk at the Riverside Gazette, watching the video for the 10th time. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, crafting a story that would run in tomorrow's paper. Multiple witnesses report police harassment of elderly resident at Municipal Dock. She'd been gathering evidence about Davidson and Reed for months, but witnesses had always been too scared to go on record. Now she had video proof. At the police station, younger officers watched the footage in the break room, their faces grim. "That's James Harrison," one whispered. "Judge Harrison's father." The name sent a ripple of unease through the room. Everyone knew the judge's reputation for handling corruption cases. Several officers quietly made calls to their union representatives, wanting to distance themselves from what was coming. Tommy's original post had been shared thousands of times by mid-afternoon. Comments poured in from local residents. "Mr. Harrison taught my son to fish. He helped me set up my first market stall. Those officers harassed my father's shop last month. Someone needs to stop these bullies with badges." The courthouse. Security guard, watching the video during his break, pulled out his phone and texted his cousin who clerked for Judge Harrison. "You need to see this. It's about your boss's dad." The clerk, known for her discretion, waited until the afternoon recess before entering the judge's chambers. "Your Honor," she began, her voice careful, "there's something you should see." She placed her tablet on his desk, the video queued up and ready to play. Judge Harrison's face remained impassive as he watched, but his knuckles whitened against the dark wood of his desk. The footage ended, and silence filled the chamber. The clerk watched as decades of judicial restraint warred with filial concern on her boss's face. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice carrying the quiet danger of deep water. "Thank you, Claire. Please clear my schedule for the rest of the afternoon." As the sun began to set, James Harrison's phone rang. He set down his evening coffee, reaching for the receiver with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "Hello, son," he said softly, knowing without asking who was calling. In the background, he could hear the familiar sounds of his son's chambers, the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the distant echo of footsteps in marble halls. "Dad," Michael's voice was controlled, but James could hear the current of anger. Underneath, "We need to talk about what happened this morning." James looked out his window at the darkening sky, remembering another lesson he'd taught his son long ago. Sometimes the biggest fish were caught not by fighting the line, but by letting it play out. "Yes," James replied, his voice steady. "I suppose we do." He could almost see his son sitting at that big desk, already planning, already thinking 10 moves ahead. Justice, like fishing, required patience and the right bait. The officers had no idea what they'd hooked with their morning's cruelty. No idea that their small show of power had caught the attention of a man who'd spent his life reeling in much bigger fish. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows across his desk. The tablet before him displayed the video for the 20th time, each viewing stoking a fire that decades of judicial restraint could barely contain. His father's dignity in the face of such petty cruelty made his chest tight with both pride and fury. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "Jack," he spoke to his old friend at the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, "I'm calling in that favor." The judge's voice was calm, measured, betraying none of the emotion churning beneath his surface. "I need everything you have on Officers Mark Davidson and Thomas Reed. Everything." While waiting for Jack's response, Michael pulled up his secure email. 3 messages had already arrived from different courthouse staff, each containing smartphone. Videos of other incidents involving the same officers. The pattern was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systematic abuse of power, caught on camera, only because they'd finally targeted someone the community rallied behind. His clerk, Claire, entered with a stack of files. "Your Honor, I've pulled every case involving Officers Davidson and Reed from the past 5 years." She paused, then added, "And there's something else." The court reporter from Division 3 sent over transcripts where their testimony seemed inconsistent. Michael nodded, his mind already assembling the pieces of what would become a legal siege. "Get me Judge Rodriguez and Judge Chen on a conference. Call, and Claire, pull every complaint filed against these officers, even the dismissed ones. Especially the dismissed ones." He stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there, 2 officers thought they were untouchable, probably laughing about their morning's work. They had no idea they'd just attacked the cornerstone of his world, not just his father, but everything his father had taught him about justice and dignity. His computer chimed. Jack's preliminary report had arrived. Michael's eyes narrowed as he read. Property holdings that exceeded their salaries. Multiple complaints disappeared from internal affairs, a pattern of businesses changing hands after visits from their patrol unit. It was all there, hidden in plain sight because no one had bothered to connect the dots. "Your Honor," Claire interrupted, "Judges Rodriguez and Chen are on line 1. Michael picked up the phone, his voice carrying the authority that had made him legendary in legal circles. "Colleagues, we have a situation that requires immediate attention." He outlined the case, watching their faces on the video conference screen shift from professional concern to controlled outrage. "I'm recusing myself officially," he concluded, "but I need your help to ensure this case gets the attention it deserves." Both judges understood immediately. They'd worked together, each handling different aspects of the investigation to ensure no accusations of personal vendetta could stick. As the call ended, Michael's private line rang. The police commissioner, already doing damage control. "Mike," the commissioner started, using the familiar form of address they'd abandoned years ago, "about this morning's incident." "Commissioner," Michael cut him off, his voice arctic, "I suggest you direct your attention to the systemic failures that allowed these officers to operate unchecked. My father's case is now the least of your department's concerns." The line went quiet as the implications sank in. After hanging up, Michael reached for his coat. It was time to visit his father. He'd learned long ago that the best legal strategies, like the best fishing techniques, were born in quiet conversations by the water. His father would counsel patience, he knew, would remind him that the biggest fish required careful handling. As he left the courthouse, Michael passed the statue of justice, her scales forever balanced, her eyes forever blind. But justice wasn't blind today. Today, justice had watched a video of two officers harassing an elderly man, had seen the boot print on a cherished photo, had witnessed the quiet dignity of a father teaching his son one final lesson about standing up to bullies. The game these officers played was about power, but they were about to learn what real power looked like. Not the petty authority of a badge abused, but the inexorable force of justice properly applied. Michael smiled slightly, remembering his father's words from long ago. "Son, sometimes the best way to fight isn't with fists or fury, but with patience and the law." The FBI's Public Corruption Task Force moved with silent efficiency through their investigation. Special Agent Sandra Martinez sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of financial records, her computer screen displaying a complex web of transactions linked to Officers Davidson and Reed. What had started as a simple harassment case was unraveling into something far more sinister. "Chief," she called to her supervisor, "you need to see this." Her finger traced a pattern of deposits made to offshore accounts, each just under the reporting threshold. Every deposit correlates with a business inspection or complaint response. In their patrol area, they weren't just bullying people. They were running a sophisticated extortion operation. Across town, in a small conference room at the courthouse, Judge Rodriguez reviewed witness statements that poured in since the viral video. A Vietnamese restaurant owner described weekly protection fees. A street vendor recalled how his cart had been mysteriously vandalized after he refused to pay. The elderly shopkeeper's hands trembled as she described how the officers had threatened to find drugs in her store if she didn't cooperate. "It's like they owned that district," one witness wrote. "Everyone knew not to cross them, not to complain. They had friends in high places." Judge Rodriguez's pen paused over this last statement. High places indeed. The growing evidence suggested protection from within the department itself. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen, at the Riverside Gazette, was piecing together her own investigation. Her desk was covered with public records requests, tax, documents, and property transfers. "Look at this pattern," she told her editor, pointing to a series of business ownership changes. Small businesses that had run-ins with these officers suddenly changed hands. The new owners, all connected to a holding company registered to Reed's uncle on the city council. The investigation was spreading like a net, catching more than just two corrupt officers. Lieutenant Hayes's signature appeared on suspiciously incomplete disciplinary reports. Internal affairs complaints vanished into administrative black holes. Even the police union representative showed signs of involvement, with unexplained increases. in his lifestyle that coincided with key complaint dismissals. In her FBI office, Agent Martinez created a timeline on her wall. Red strings connected photos, documents, and witness statements. They started small, she explained to her team. Petty harassment, small payoffs. But over the years, it evolved. They learned which businesses were vulnerable, which officials could be bought, which witnesses would stay quiet. The evidence was damning. Security camera footage showed regular meetings between the officers and known criminals. Bank records revealed a pattern of deposits that coincided with reported incidents of harassment. Phone records painted a picture of coordination that went far beyond two patrol officers acting alone. Judge Chen, reviewing the mounting evidence in her chambers, felt a chill run down her spine. "This isn't just about police corruption," she told her clerk. "This is about a system that enabled it, protected it, even encouraged it." She thought of James Harrison, standing dignified in the face of their bullying, unknowingly providing the thread that would unravel their entire operation. Back at the FBI office, Agent Martinez added another photo to her wall. Lieutenant Hayes, stepping out of a luxury car he shouldn't have been able to afford on his salary. "They got sloppy," she noted. "Success made them confident, and confidence made them careless." She pinned up another image, Reed's uncle leaving a private meeting with known criminal figures. The investigation moved with methodical precision, each new piece of evidence carefully documented and verified. This wasn't just about justice for one elderly man. It was about exposing a cancer that had grown within the department, protected by badges and bureaucracy. Sarah Chen's article was taking shape on her computer screen. Viral video exposes years of systematic police corruption. Her sources within the department had started talking, sensing which way the wind was blowing. Junior officers, tired of working under corrupt superiors, provided dates, times, and locations of suspicious activities. As the sun set over Riverside, Judge Rodriguez sat back in his chair, surveying the mountain of evidence before him. The case had grown beyond anything they'd initially suspected. It wasn't just about two officers harassing an old man at the docks. It was about a system of corruption that had terrorized an entire community. And it had all started to crumble because they'd chosen the wrong target. A quiet fisherman whose son had spent a lifetime learning how to reel in much bigger fish. Officer Davidson noticed the changes first. The usual morning greetings at the precinct grew cold, replaced by averted eyes and hurried steps. Their regular booth at Eddie's Diner, always reserved for the morning coffee run, was suddenly occupied. The owner, who had been comping their meals for years, now insisted on running their credit cards. "Something's off," he muttered to Reed as they sat in their patrol car. The familiar comfort of their morning watch spot now feeling exposed and vulnerable. Their phones had been unusually quiet. No calls from their usual contributors, no friendly tips from other officers, no casual chats with their protective network of corrupt officials. Reed scrolled through local news on his phone, his face growing paler by the minute. "Mark," he said, his voice unusually tight, "that old man at the dock, the videos everywhere." He turned the screen to show Davidson the Riverside Gazette's latest headline: FBI launches investigation into police corruption following viral video. The article mentioned their names. Worse, it mentioned patterns of behavior, suspicious financial transactions, and unnamed sources within the department. Lieutenant Hayes had stopped answering their calls, his secretary citing his sudden vacation time. Reed's uncle on the city council sent a terse text: "Don't contact me, lawyer up." Their patrol route felt different now. Store owners who used to tremble at their approach now watched them with quiet defiance. Smartphones appeared whenever they stepped out of their car, recording their every move. The power they'd wielded so confidently just days ago was slipping through their fingers like sand. "We need to do something," Reed insisted, panic edging into his voice. "Maybe if we talk to internal affairs first? Cut a deal." Davidson silenced him with a glare, but doubt had already crept into his own thoughts. Their carefully constructed world of influence and intimidation was crumbling, and they could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down on them. Back at the station, their lockers had been subtly vandalized. Nothing obvious, just small signs of disrespect. Their paperwork took longer to process, their equipment requests were delayed, and younger officers no longer volunteered to cover their shifts. The thin blue line that had protected them for so long was quietly stepping aside. Davidson tried calling in favors, but doors that had always been open suddenly closed. Judge Harrison's name echoed through their nightmares. They'd learned too late whose father they'd harassed. "Do you know what they call him?" a fellow officer whispered during a smoke break. "The Gavel of God, and you just gave him a personal reason to look at everything we've done." Their usual lunch spot, a high-end steakhouse that never seemed to charge them full price, suddenly couldn't find their reservation. The maitre, who had always greeted them with deferential respect, now looked through them as if they were invisible. Outside, they spotted a familiar face, one of Agent Martinez's FBI team, not even trying to be subtle about their surveillance. Reed's hands shook as he counted the money in his offshore account, planning an escape that deep down he knew was impossible. Davidson sat in his home office, staring at years of carefully documented contributions and gifts, realizing too late that his meticulous record-keeping had created a paper trail of evidence. Their phones buzzed constantly with text messages from former business associates, people cutting ties, demanding assurances, or simply delivering thinly veiled threats. The protection they'd offered now seemed worthless, and those they'd pressured over the years sensed weakness in their former tormentors. "We should have known," Davidson said during their afternoon patrol, their car parked far from their usual spots, trying to avoid the cameras they now saw everywhere. A man that age, fishing every day at the same spot, should have checked who he was. Reed didn't respond, too busy watching the rearview mirror, jumping at every passing police car or black SUV. Their badges, once symbols of untouchable authority, now felt like targets on their chests. Every radio call could be a setup. Every routine stop could be monitored. Every interaction could become evidence. As the sun set on their shift, they watched the courthouse lights glowing in the distance. Somewhere in that building, the machinery of justice they'd manipulated for so long was turning against them. And in his chambers, a judge they'd never met was methodically reviewing every case, every complaint, every suspicious incident from their careers. They'd spent years fishing for power in the murky waters of corruption, never realizing they were the ones being reeled in. The community center on Riverside Drive buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. Every folding chair was filled, with people standing along the walls, all gathered for what was supposed to be a routine town hall meeting. But there was nothing routine about tonight. Sarah Chen from the Riverside Gazette sat in the front row, her recorder running, watching as years of fear and silence transformed into a tide of testimony. Maria from the fruit stand was the first to speak, her voice trembling, at first, but growing stronger with each word. For 3 years, they demanded protection money from every vendor at the dock. When my cousin Paolo refused, she paused, gathering courage. They planted drugs in his truck. He spent 6 months in jail before the charges were dropped. Her story opened the floodgates. One by one, community members stepped up to the microphone. Mr. Wong, the elderly owner of the corner grocery, described how officers Davidson and Reed had systematically extorted his entire block. They called it community outreach fees, he said, bitter irony in his voice. Said it was for extra patrol services. Tommy Chen's video of James Harrison's harassment played on the large screen, but it was no longer just about one incident. Each person who spoke added another piece to the puzzle of corruption that had haunted their community. Small business owners described mysterious fires that started after refused payments. Restaurant owners talked about health inspections that appeared only when protection money was late. "They took more than our money," said Mrs. Patel, her sari wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "They took our dignity, made us feel powerless in our own neighborhood. Heads nodded throughout the room. Everyone had a story, and finally, they had the courage to tell them. Local news crews captured every testimony. The story had grown beyond the Riverside Gazette, attracting attention from major networks. In the back of the room, FBI agents quietly took notes, Agent Martinez adding new threads to her already complex investigation. What surprised everyone was the number of younger police officers who came forward. Officer Sarah Rodriguez, 3 years on the force, described how Davidson and Reed had tried to train new recruits in their methods. They called it community management, she testified, her badge displayed proudly despite her fear. Those of us who refused were assigned to the worst shifts, denied backup when we needed it. The meeting stretched late into the night. Council. Members who had long ignored complaints shifted uncomfortably in their seats as evidence of their complicity became harder to deny. Reed's uncle was notably absent, but his empty chair seemed to speak volumes about the changing power dynamics. In Riverside, James Harrison sat quietly through it all, his presence a reminder of how a single act of dignity in the face of corruption had broken the dam of silence. He didn't need to speak. His story had already sparked the revolution. Instead, he listened, his weathered hands folded in his lap, as his community found its voice. Outside the community center, impromptu support groups formed. People exchanged phone numbers, promised to testify, offered to help gather evidence. The fear that had kept them isolated was transforming into a solidarity that couldn't be intimidated. Local business owners, emboldened by the growing movement, began posting signs in their windows. No more protection payments and community stands united. The messages were clear. The old system of fear and extortion was ending. As the meeting concluded, Maria approached James, tears in her eyes. "Mr. Harrison," she said, taking his hand, "thank you, not just for standing up to them, but for showing us we could stand up too." Around them, the community center hummed with a new energy, not of fear, but of restoration. The next morning's Riverside Gazette headline read, "Community breaks silence, years of police corruption exposed." Sarah Chen's article detailed not just the crimes, but the courage of those who finally spoke out. The story's final quote came from a young officer, Rodriguez. "We wear these badges to protect and serve. It's time we remembered what that really means." Agent Martinez stood before her evidence wall, now spanning an entire conference room at the FBI field office. What had started as an investigation into 2 corrupt officers had evolved into something far more disturbing. Red strings connected. Photos, documents, and testimonies revealing a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Riverside's power structure. "It's like a pyramid scheme of corruption," she explained to the task force team. "Davidson and Reed weren't just random bad cops. They were foot soldiers in a much larger operation." She pointed to a complex diagram of money flows. Protection money collected from street vendors didn't just line the officers' pockets. It moved upward through a sophisticated network of fake businesses and shell companies. Lieutenant Hayes's computer had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Encrypted emails revealed a system of kickbacks that implicated 3 city council members, 2 senior police officials, and even a deputy mayor. The lieutenant had kept meticulous records, perhaps as insurance against the day he might need leverage. "Look at this pattern," Agent Wilson noted, pulling up property records. Every time a business refused to pay protection money, they'd face a series of coordinated attacks. Health inspections, fire code violations, tax audits, all orchestrated through different departments. Within months, they'd be forced to sell, always to the same group of buyers. Those buyers, they discovered, were connected to Councilman Reed's private holding company, the same company that had mysteriously acquired prime real estate throughout Riverside's developing waterfront district. Properties that would soon be worth millions once the city's renovation project began, a project overseen by the same corrupt officials. In Judge Chen's chambers, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Her clerk had discovered a pattern in case assignments. Every major complaint against Davidson and Reed had been carefully steered toward friendly judges or buried in administrative hearings. It wasn't random chance. It was orchestrated manipulation of the judicial system. They had people everywhere, the clerk explained, spreading out a timeline of cases. Court clerks, administrative assistants, even janitors were paid to monitor case filings and alert them to potential threats. The corruption had seeped into every crack of the system, creating an invisible network of eyes and ears. Sarah Chen, working late at the Gazette, received an anonymous email. Attached were records of offshore accounts showing regular payments, from known crime families to high-ranking city officials, the same officials who had consistently blocked attempts to investigate police corruption. The reporter's hands trembled as she realized the scope of what she was uncovering. Back at the FBI office, Agent Martinez added new photos to her wall. Security camera footage showed late-night meetings between Lieutenant Hayes and several prominent business leaders. The same leaders who had recently won major city contracts that had been denied to more qualified but unconnected companies. It's not just about shaking down small businesses, she told her team. That was just the visible part. The real money came from controlling city contracts, manipulating property values, and laundering money for bigger criminal enterprises. The evidence suggested that Davidson and Reed's harassment of locals served a dual purpose, generating immediate profit and creating pressure to sell valuable properties. A breakthrough came when a junior IT specialist at City Hall discovered hidden software on the municipal network. The program had been systematically altering records, hiding complaints, and creating false documentation. The digital trail led back to a tech company owned by one of Reed's associates. The corruption had created its own ecosystem. Lower ranking officers like Davidson and Reed handled street-level intimidation. Mid-level managers like Hayes coordinated and covered up their activities. Higher-ups in the police department and city government provided protection and legitimacy. Each level fed the ones above it, creating a self-sustaining machine of corruption. Judge Rodriguez, reviewing the mounting evidence, saw how the system had been designed to appear random and disconnected. They built it like a maze, he noted, to his clerk, each piece separated from the others, making it nearly impossible to see the whole picture, until now. The investigation had uncovered not just corruption, but a systematic dismantling of justice itself. Every safeguard, every check and balance had been carefully subverted or corrupted. It was a machine built for power and profit, operating in plain sight behind a thin veneer of legitimate authority. But like all machines, it had a fatal flaw. Its creators had never imagined that harassing an elderly fisherman would lead to their undoing. They had built their fortress of corruption so high that they'd forgotten to watch for simple things, like a son's love for his father and a judge's unwavering commitment to justice. The counterattack began with whispers. Local tabloids suddenly ran stories questioning James Harrison's character. Anonymous sources claimed he had a history of confrontations with police. Old parking tickets from the 1980s mysteriously surfaced. The message was clear. The corruption machine wasn't going down without a fight. "Look at this," Sarah Chen told her editor, spreading out the latest round of attack pieces. 3 different papers, same talking points, similar phrasing. Someone's orchestrating this. The stories painted James as a troublemaker, suggesting he had provoked the officers and edited the viral video to remove his own aggressive behavior. The police union held a press conference, their spokesperson reading from a carefully prepared statement. "Our officers face difficult situations daily. This rush to judgment based on a selectively edited video does a disservice to all law enforcement." Behind the scenes, union officials were pressuring younger officers who had spoken out, threatening their careers and pensions. Judge Harrison found himself under attack too. Anonymous complaints about his conduct began appearing in judicial review. boards. Old cases he'd presided over were suddenly being scrutinized for bias. A local news channel ran a piece suggesting he had a vendetta against law enforcement, carefully cherry-picking statistics from his years on the bench. "They're getting desperate," Agent Martinez observed, watching the smear campaign unfold. "But desperate people make mistakes." She was right. In their haste to discredit the investigation, the corrupt officials were leaving even more evidence. Every attack could be traced back, revealing new connections in their network. Lieutenant Hayes, still officially on vacation, was spotted meeting with known members of a criminal defense law firm specializing in police corruption cases. Surveillance photos showed him carrying thick folders, potentially blackmail material on other officers and officials. The lieutenant was clearly preparing to save himself by burning others. At the docks, pressure mounted on the witnesses who had spoken out. Health inspectors suddenly found violations at Maria's fruit stand. Tommy Chen's family restaurant faced repeated code enforcement visits, but instead of cowering, the community rallied. Other vendors took turns manning Maria's stand so she could deal with the harassment. Local lawyers offered pro bono services to fight the citations. The city council called an emergency session, ostensibly to address community concerns about police oversight. But the real agenda became clear when Councilman Reed introduced a motion to reduce funding for internal investigations and limit the scope of corruption probes. The public gallery, packed with community members, erupted in angry shouts. "My father taught me something about fish," Judge Harrison told Agent Martinez during a private meeting. "When they're caught in a net, their desperate thrashing only entangles them further." The judge's calm demeanor in the face of attacks had only enhanced his reputation for integrity. Social media accounts linked to the corrupt officials began spreading conspiracy theories. They claimed the whole investigation was a plot by real estate developers to devalue Riverside property. They suggested James Harrison was a front for organized crime. Each wild accusation revealed more about their own operation than they realized. Pressure came from unexpected directions. Judge Harrison's fellow judges received calls from political donors suggesting that supporting the investigation could affect future campaign contributions. But the corruption machine had miscalculated. Their threats only hardened the resolve of honest officials who had long suspected something was wrong. Sarah Chen received her own share of threats, some veiled, some explicit. Her editor called her into his office looking uncomfortable. "Some powerful people are concerned about your coverage," he began. But before he could continue, she placed a recorder on his desk, already running. The implied threat died in his throat. The pushback reached its peak when someone broke into James Harrison's home. Nothing was taken, but his fishing photos were scattered across the floor, some torn. It was meant to intimidate, but it had the opposite effect. The community organized a volunteer security watch. Veterans, off-duty firefighters, and honest cops took turns ensuring the elderly fisherman's safety. "They don't understand," James told his son during their weekly fishing session, unchanged despite the chaos around them. "Real strength isn't about power over others. It's about standing firm when that power tries to push you down." As if to emphasize his point, he cast his line into the water, the same graceful motion he'd practiced for decades. The corrupt officials' desperate attempts to maintain control were backfiring. Each attack, each threat, each smear campaign only brought more evidence to light. They had spent years building a system based on fear and intimidation. Now they were learning a hard lesson. Once people stop being afraid, that system begins to crumble. Dawn painted the river in shades of gold as James and Michael Harrison sat side by side on the dock, their lines cast into the gentle current. It had been their Sunday ritual for decades, but today felt different. The weight of recent events hung in the air between them, making even familiar silences feel heavy with meaning. You know, James said, adjusting his line with practiced ease, your mother would have been proud of you. He rarely spoke of her, the pain of her loss still fresh even after 20 years. Not just because you became a judge, because of who you are when wearing that robe. Michael watched his bobber dance on the water's surface. I learned from the best, Dad. Everything I know about justice, real justice, I learned right here on this dock. He remembered countless mornings watching his father share his catch with struggling families, teaching neighborhood kids to fish, treating everyone with the same quiet dignity, regardless of their status. James chuckled softly. I just taught you to fish, son. You figured out the rest on your own. His weathered hands worked at untangling a knot in his line, the same hands that had once guided Michael's smaller ones through the same motion. Though I suppose there are some similarities between fishing and justice. More than you might think, Michael replied, thinking of his courtroom. Patience, knowing when to wait and when to act. Understanding that the surface doesn't always show what's happening below. He paused, watching a bird dive for its breakfast. You taught me that every fish deserves a fair chance, even the small ones. Especially the small ones. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher. Around them, the dock came to life. Vendors setting up their stalls, early morning fishermen taking their spots. Each person who passed offered a respectful greeting, not to Judge Harrison, but to James, the man who had been their constant through decades of change. They tried to intimidate me yesterday, James said matter-of-factly, describing the break-in at his house. Scattered my old photos around. He smiled slightly. They don't understand that memories aren't in the pictures, they're in here. He tapped his chest. Michael's grip tightened on his rod, anger flashing in his eyes, but his father's calm presence steadied him, as it had so many times before. We'll get them, Dad. Not just for what they did to you, but for everyone they've hurt. I know you will, son. James reeled in his line, checking the bait. But remember what I taught you about playing a big fish. Pull too hard, and the line breaks. Sometimes you have to let them tire themselves out. The metaphor wasn't lost on Michael. In his chambers, evidence of corruption grew daily as the desperate officials thrashed against the investigation's net. His father's wisdom, learned through years of patience on these waters, was proving just as valuable in the courtroom as it had been on the dock. A tug on James's line interrupted their conversation. Together, they worked to reel in the fish, their movements synchronized by years of practice. It was a good-sized bass, fighting hard against the hook. See how it struggles? James commented. The guilty ones always fight the hardest. As they freed the fish and released it back into the river, Michael noticed something. Despite everything, the harassment, the threats, the smear campaigns, his father's hands remained steady. The same quiet dignity that had impressed the viral video's viewers was no act. It was the core of who James Harrison had always been. You never told me, Michael said suddenly, why you kept fishing here all these years, even after you could afford better spots, more exclusive places. The question had nagged at him since childhood. James cast his line out again, the motion as smooth as it had been 50 years ago. Because this is where the people are, son. Real people working hard, trying to make honest lives for their families. He adjusted his worn cap, a fixture as familiar as the dock itself. Someone needs to remind them that there's still good in the world, that dignity isn't about what you have, but who you are. Michael understood then, more clearly than ever, why the corrupt officer's attempt to humiliate his father had backfired so spectacularly. They had tried to break a man who had spent his entire life building something far stronger than their power, a legacy of quiet integrity that had shaped not just his son, but an entire community. As the morning wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics, old fishing stories, shared memories, plans for future Sundays. But both men knew that something had deepened between them. The crisis that had meant to break them had instead revealed the full strength of their bond, forged through decades of dawn conversations and shared wisdom on this weathered dock. The federal courthouse hummed with unusual energy as Judge Rodriguez prepared for the first major hearing. The grand jury had worked through the weekend, reviewing evidence that filled dozens of boxes. Now, in courtroom 306, the first threads of justice were about to be pulled. Agent Martinez sat at the prosecution table, surrounded by meticulously organized files. Each document told part of a story that had taken months to unravel. Behind her, the gallery was packed with community members, their presence a silent testimony to years of suffering under corrupt authority. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "the United States presents evidence of a criminal enterprise operating within the Riverside Police Department." She gestured to the screens around the courtroom, where a complex organizational chart appeared. What began as an investigation into 2 officers has revealed a systematic corruption of our entire justice system. Lieutenant Hayes sat at the defense table, his usual confidence replaced by nervous finger-tapping. His high-priced lawyer couldn't hide the sweat staining his collar. They both knew what was in those files. Years of detailed records that Hayes had kept as insurance were now being used to dismantle the very system he had helped build. "The evidence will show," Martinez continued, "a pattern of extortion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice that spans more than a decade." She played the video of James Harrison's harassment, but now it was just one piece in a larger mosaic of corruption. The testimony began with Officer Sarah Rodriguez, her badge gleaming as she took the stand. "They called it training for new officers," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word, "teaching us how to identify revenue opportunities in our patrol areas." Her testimony laid bare the systematic corruption of young officers, showing how the cycle perpetuated itself. Financial experts took the stand next, unraveling the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Spreadsheets and bank records flashed across the courtroom screens, showing how protection money flowed upward through the organization, transforming into seemingly legitimate business transactions. Maria testified about the protection racket. At the docks, her voice trembling but determined. "They threatened our licenses, our livelihoods, our families," she said. Behind her, other vendors nodded, their own experiences reflected in her words. "We paid because we were afraid, but also because we knew no one would help us. The whole system was corrupt." Judge Rodriguez listened intently, his expression grave as the evidence mounted. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle, showing how deeply the corruption had penetrated every level of law enforcement and city government. His notes filled page after page, documenting what would become one of the most significant corruption cases in the state's history. The defense tried to object, to discredit witnesses, to challenge evidence, but the foundation of the case was too solid. Agent Martinez had built it methodically, each piece supporting the others, creating an interlocking structure of evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Tommy Chen's video played again, but this time synchronized with surveillance. Footage from multiple angles, showing the coordinated nature of the harassment. Digital forensics experts testified about the systematic alteration of police records, showing how complaints vanished and evidence disappeared. A forensic accountant took the stand, presenting a detailed analysis of the corrupt officer's finances. "Officer Davidson's reported income cannot explain his property holdings or lifestyle," she testified. "The same pattern appears across multiple officials involved in this enterprise." Charts showed inexplicable wealth flowing to people who were supposed to protect and serve. The most damaging testimony came from a former clerk in internal affairs. She described how complaints were buried, investigations sabotaged, and witnesses intimidated. "It wasn't just a few bad officers," she explained. "It was a system designed to protect corruption and punish anyone who tried to expose it." As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Rodriguez looked out over the crowded courtroom, the community members who had lived under this corruption for so long. The honest officers who had finally found the courage to speak out, the federal agents who had untangled the web of deception, and in the back, sitting quietly but attentively, James Harrison, the man whose dignity in the face of abuse had started it all. The judge's gavel fell, its sound echoing through the hushed courtroom. This was just the beginning, everyone knew. More hearings would follow, more evidence would be presented, more officials would face justice. But something had shifted today. The machinery of justice, so long corrupted and corroded, had begun to turn in the right direction again. The interrogation room at the FBI field office had seen a steady stream of visitors over the past week. Today, Lieutenant Hayes sat alone at the table, his police union lawyer conspicuously absent. On the desk before him lay a thick folder, his own meticulous records of 15 years of corruption, now transformed into evidence against his former allies. "I want a deal," he said to Agent Martinez, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give you everything, names, dates, accounts, all of it." The lieutenant's hand shook as he reached for his water glass. "They're going to try to pin this all on me. I need protection." Across town, Officer Reed paced in his attorney's office, panic evident in every movement. "Davidson's wife just called," he said, running fingers through unkempt hair. "He's talking to the feds right now. That bastard's going to throw me under." The bus? The lawyer watched his client unravel, knowing the house of cards was collapsing. At the police station, a different kind of chaos unfolded. Officers who had long been part of the corrupt system rushed to distance themselves from their former protectors. Internal affairs was flooded with sudden remembrances of incidents previously forgotten. Each officer tried to position themselves as an unwilling participant or secret whistleblower. Councilman Reed's office issued a terse statement announcing his temporary leave of absence, citing health concerns. But security cameras caught him shredding documents at midnight, his desperation evident in every frantic movement. Unknown to him, every page had already been digitally archived by FBI technicians weeks ago. "It's fascinating to watch, Agent," Martinez told her team, updating the evidence wall. "They're so busy betraying each other that they're giving us more than we even knew to look for." Each desperate attempt at self-preservation revealed new layers of corruption, new connections, new crimes. Davidson broke first, offering a complete confession in exchange for consideration in sentencing. "It wasn't just the protection money," he revealed. "We were helping them identify properties for acquisition, harassing owners until they sold cheap to the councilman's shell companies." His testimony implicated dozens of officials in a real estate conspiracy that spanned years. The police union, sensing the changing winds, issued a statement distancing itself from the accused officers. "These individuals do not represent the values of law enforcement," they declared, conveniently forgetting their earlier defense of the same officers. Inside the union office, representatives scrambled to delete emails and records, not realizing their digital tracks were already preserved. Lieutenant Hayes's testimony proved devastating. His detailed records included dates, amounts, and participants in hundreds of corrupt transactions. "Everyone got a cut," he explained, "from beat cops to City Hall. It was like a pyramid scheme of corruption." His revelations sent shockwaves through every level of city government. A late-night emergency session of the city council dissolved into chaos as members accused each other of involvement. The public gallery watched in stunned silence as years of carefully maintained alliances crumbled in minutes. Sarah Chen's live blog of the meeting crashed news websites as readers followed the meltdown in real time. Officer Reed, seeing the walls close in, made one final desperate move. He called a press conference, planning to expose everyone involved. But before he could speak, his own lawyer intervened, recognizing the legal suicide his client was about to commit. The aborted conference only served to confirm his guilt in the public's eye. At the FBI office, agents worked overtime to process the flood of new information. "They're like drowning men," one agent observed, pulling each other down in their desperation to stay afloat. The evidence wall had to be expanded as new connections and crimes came to light through panicked confessions. The courthouse became the scene of a grim parade as former conspirators arrived to negotiate plea deals. Each brought evidence against others, hoping to trade information for leniency. Judge Rodriguez's chambers were filled with prosecutors working to manage the growing cascade of witnesses and testimony. Downtown, moving trucks appeared outside offices and homes as implicated. Officials attempted to flee, but federal surveillance teams were ready, documenting every attempt to hide assets or destroy evidence. The corrupt system's own paranoia became its undoing as former allies rushed to betray each other before being betrayed themselves. Through it all, James Harrison continued his daily routine at the dock, watching the sun rise over waters that seemed somehow cleaner now. The corrupt machine that had terrorized his community was eating itself alive, proving what he had always taught his son. Truth, like cream, rises to the top. You just have to wait for the water to settle. The federal courthouse stood like a temple of justice against the morning sky. Inside courtroom A, every seat was filled as Judge Rodriguez prepared to deliver his final judgment in what the press had dubbed the Harrison effect. How one act of harassment against an elderly fisherman had exposed decades of corruption. The defendants sat in a row, their once proud postures now bent under the weight of their crimes. Officers Davidson and Reed, stripped of their badges, wore civilian clothes that seemed to hang awkwardly on their frames. Behind them, Lieutenant Hayes, Councilman Reed, and a line of other corrupt officials waited for the judgment that would end their careers and possibly their freedom. James Harrison sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. His son, having recused himself from the case, sat beside him as a son rather than a judge. The dock vendors, Maria, Tommy, and others, filled the rows behind them, their presence a testament to the community's resilience. Agent Martinez rose to present the government's final summary. Your Honor, what began as a simple case of police harassment has revealed one of the most extensive corruption networks ever uncovered in our state. She gestured to the mountain of evidence boxes. These defendants didn't just break the law, they broke the public's trust. The screens around the courtroom displayed a complex chart showing the flow of illegal money, each line representing betrayed trust and abused power. Through systematic intimidation and corruption, they created a parallel government, one that served their greed rather than the public good. One by one, the evidence was reviewed. Davidson's confession played on the screens, his voice cracking as he detailed years of extortion and abuse. We thought we were untouchable, he admitted. We forgot that the badge means serving the public, not ourselves. Lieutenant Hayes's meticulously kept records spelled doom for dozens of officials. His testimony had been devastating. It was like a cancer, he explained. Each corrupt act made the next one easier until we couldn't remember what honest police work looked like. The community members testified about years of fear and intimidation. Maria spoke of lost businesses and broken dreams. Tommy Chen described how his video of James Harrison had given others the courage to speak out. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence. Judge Rodriguez, who had presided over hundreds of cases in his career, leaned forward as the final arguments concluded. Before I deliver my judgment, he announced, I want to hear from the man whose dignity in the face of corruption began this process. Mr. Harrison, would you address the court? James Harrison rose slowly, his son Michael watching with quiet pride. The old fisherman's voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. I've fished the same spot for 70 years, he began. I've seen the river rise and fall, seen good times and bad, but I never lost faith that justice, like the tide, always returns. He turned slightly to face the defendants. You thought a badge gave you power, But real power comes from serving others, from standing tall even when threatened, from remembering that every person deserves respect. His words, simple but profound, brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom. Judge. Rodriguez's verdict was comprehensive and devastating. Davidson and Reed, 15 years each for corruption and civil rights violations. Lieutenant Hayes, 12 years for orchestrating the cover-ups. Councilman Reed and his co-conspirators, various sentences for their roles in the criminal enterprise. Additionally, millions in restitution would be paid to the community they had terrorized. Let this case serve as a reminder, the judge concluded, his voice firm. The law is not a weapon to be wielded by the powerful against the weak. It is a shield that protects all citizens equally. When those entrusted with upholding the law become its worst violators, the very foundation of justice is threatened. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, the community members hugged and cried. Years of fear and intimidation ended with the bang of a gavel. Outside, reporters clustered to capture reactions. But the most powerful image was the simplest. James Harrison and his son walking quietly away from the courthouse, their fishing rods waiting in the car for their usual Sunday morning ritual. "You know what, Dad?" Michael said as they walked. "You were right all along. Justice, like fishing, requires patience, integrity, and faith that doing the right thing matters." James smiled, knowing his life's most important lesson had been well learned. The days following the verdicts brought a palpable change to Riverside. Police cruisers patrolling the dock area were met not with fear, but with cautious acknowledgement from vendors who no longer flinched at the sight of a badge. Young officers, freed from the corrupt system that had once demanded their compliance, began building new relationships with the community they served. At the police department, newly appointed Chief Sandra Martinez, formerly Agent Martinez, supervised the implementation of sweeping reforms. "We're not just changing policies," she announced to her officers. "We're changing the culture." The walls that had once displayed photos of decorated officers now showcased community engagement initiatives and citizen appreciation awards. The transformation was most visible at the docks. The protection fees that had once drained the life from small businesses disappeared, replaced by legitimate permits displayed proudly in windows. Maria's fruit stand flourished, now expanding to include a small cafe where officers and citizens sat together, sharing coffee and conversation rather than threats and fear. Tommy Chen found himself appointed to a newly formed civilian oversight committee, his video recording instincts now officially sanctioned as part of a transparency initiative. "We're not just watching for bad behavior anymore," he explained to a local news crew. "We're documenting the good things too, showing how police and community can work together." The ripples of change reached the courthouse as well. Judge Michael Harrison's chambers became a focal point for judicial reform, with judges from across the state visiting to study how corruption could be identified and prevented. His father's experience had inspired a new approach to justice, one that emphasized dignity and respect over power and intimidation. Inside the police academy, the curriculum underwent a dramatic revision. Veteran officers who had resisted the old corruption shared their stories with new recruits, teaching them that true authority comes from community trust, not fear. The Harrison case became a mandatory case study, with James's dignity in the face of harassment held up as an example of the citizens they were sworn to protect. Former Officer Davidson's confession became required viewing for every cadet. "I lost my way," his recorded testimony declared, "because I forgot that the badge means serving the public, not dominating them." His words, tinged with genuine remorse, served as a powerful warning about the seductive nature of corrupted power. The city council chambers, cleaned of corruption, saw the passage of the Harrison Act, a comprehensive package of reforms ensuring transparency in law enforcement and protecting whistleblowers. Councilwoman Maria Delgado, once a frightened fruit vendor, now led the committee overseeing its implementation. At the FBI field office, a new task force dedicated to public corruption bore James Harrison's name, not because he had asked for recognition, but because his story exemplified how one person's dignity could spark systemic change. Agent Wilson, who had helped build the case, now trained other agents in recognizing patterns of institutional corruption. The Riverside Gazette's Sarah Chen won a national award for her coverage of the case, but her most meaningful recognition came from the small business owners who finally felt safe sharing their stories. Her series, After the Badge: Rebuilding Trust, documented the community's healing process, showing how honest police work could repair years of damaged relationships. The seized assets from the corrupt officials were channeled into community programs. The dock area, once a symbol of oppression, became a model of community policing. Officers walked their beats on foot, learning vendors' names, helping elderly shoppers with their bags, becoming part of the community fabric, rather than its oppressors. James Harrison's fishing spot became an unofficial landmark. Young officers would sometimes sit with him in the early morning hours, learning not about fishing, but about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of public service. His quiet wisdom, once shared only with his son, now helped shape a new generation of law enforcement. As the sun set over Riverside, casting long shadows across the transformed dock district, James and Michael Harrison sat in their usual spots, lines cast into the quiet water. "You know what amazes me, Dad?" Michael said, watching a new patrol officer help Maria close her stand. How one moment of standing up to bullies could change an entire city. James smiled, his weathered hands steady on his fishing rod. "Sometimes," he replied, "all it takes is one person refusing to bend, to remind everyone else that they can stand tall too." Around them, the evening air carried the sounds of a community, no longer living in fear. Children laughing, vendors calling out their wares, and the gentle splash of fish rising to meet the coming night. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Riverside docks, just as it always had. James Harrison, now 94, made his way down the familiar wooden planks, his tackle box swinging gently at his side. But the dock he walked today was different from the one that had seen his confrontation with corrupt officers those many months ago. Small plaques now marked certain spots along the waterfront, simple bronze markers telling the story of how a community had reclaimed its dignity. One stood near James's regular fishing spot, though he had opposed the idea when first suggested. "The fish don't care about plaques," he'd said with a chuckle. But the community had insisted, wanting future generations to remember. Maria's expanded. Cafe buzz with morning activity. Police officers and dock workers shared breakfast, their conversations flowing easily, free from the tension that had once defined such interactions. Behind the counter, a framed newspaper article told the story of the Harrison effect, as it had come to be known throughout law enforcement circles nationwide. "Morning, Mr. Harrison," called Officer Sarah Rodriguez, now a lieutenant, as she finished her coffee. She'd made it a point to check the dock during her morning rounds, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for the place where real change had begun. Her badge, once a symbol of intimidation, now shone with restored purpose. Tommy Chen's camera store had opened next to the cafe, its walls displaying photographs of the community's transformation. The infamous video that had sparked everything, played on a small screen in the corner, alongside newer footage showing police and citizens working together at community events. From surveillance to celebration, the display's title read. Judge Michael Harrison still joined his father every Sunday morning, their fishing ritual unchanged by the events their actions had sparked. But now they were sometimes interrupted by visiting officials from other cities, seeking to understand how Riverside had transformed its law enforcement culture so dramatically. James would just smile and keep fishing, letting his son explain the complex simplicity of standing up for what's right. The Harrison Act had become a model for police reform across the state. Its principles, transparency, accountability, and community engagement, were being studied and implemented in departments nationwide. But in Riverside, these weren't just policies on paper. They were lived experiences, demonstrated daily, in the interactions between officers and citizens. As James settled into his usual spot, he noticed a young boy watching him curiously. "Want to learn how to fish?" he asked, just as he had done countless times before. The boy nodded eagerly, and James began the familiar process of teaching proper technique. But this lesson, like all his interactions now, carried a deeper meaning, a demonstration of how dignity and respect could bridge any divide. A fresh-faced rookie officer patrolling the dock stopped to watch the impromptu fishing lesson. James recognized the look in her eyes, the same earnest desire to serve that he'd seen in good officers throughout his life. She represented the new generation of law enforcement, trained under reforms born from his simple act of standing. Firm against abuse of power, the biggest fights, James told the young boy as they waited for a bite, aren't always won with fists or force. Sometimes they're won by simply refusing to bow to wrong. The rookie officer listened too, understanding that this wasn't just about fishing. As the morning wore on, the dock filled with its usual mix of vendors, fishermen, and passers-by. But there was a lightness to their movements, a freedom in their interactions that spoke of deeper changes. The shadow of corruption had lifted, replaced by the brightness of restored trust and community pride. James checked his line, his movements as sure as they had been 7 decades ago when he first claimed this spot. The water still held its mysteries. The fish still needed patience to catch, and the sun still rose with each new day. Some things hadn't changed at all, and that was good too. An old Chinese proverb says that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. The Harass effect had shown that the same was true of justice. It's never too late to stand up for what's right, to reclaim dignity, to rebuild trust. As James Harrison cast his line into the morning waters, he knew that the ripples from that one moment of defiance would continue long after he was gone, teaching future generations that true power lies not in force or fear, but in the quiet strength of unwavering dignity.